we're fortunate to have Andy Bako giving a presentation today. Andy is an emerging scholar with the School of Architecture. He'll be here for 2 years. We're really happy that you're here. Andy is a licensed architect in Canada and the founder of ABAD Company, a multidisciplinary design practice based in Toronto. Before joining us here, he served as the 2023-2024 Shidlowski Emerging Faculty Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor at the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State University, where his design research was showcased in the Train Yourself exhibition at the Armstrong Gallery. He has also held teaching positions at the John Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto and at Carleton University, where you also got your bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout his career, he has led the production of work for esteemed institutions such as the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, the Aga Khan Foundation, and the University of Toronto. He holds a Master of Architecture with distinction from the GSD at Harvard, where he was awarded the 2019 Digital Design Prize for his thesis project, Normal House, which he explored the intersection of image culture, suburbia, and the limitations of contemporary design software. He has worked for award-winning architectural firms and designers, including Adamson Associates Architects and OMA. In addition, as a
Okanagan
he has worked with Vulcan Okanaglu Design. His work has been featured on platforms such as Coos Arc and Sucker Punch Daily and the Hot Air Gallery in New York. He has also contributed to international exhibitions, including Countryside, the Future, at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City. His recent publications include contributions to Yale Paprika Journal, Pool, and the ACSA 2024 International Conference Proceedings. The title of your talk is The Meat We Live In, and I'm going to hand it over to you to describe your talk.
Great.
And what that means.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
Happy.
Thank you.
All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Andy Bako, and before I start my lecture today, I have a few thank yous. Firstly, to Elizabeth for the wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank Alan Shearer for the invitation to speak to you all today. Bridget Gale Ground for the coordination and planning for today's event. And thank you as well to Dean Heather Woofter, Corey Beeg, Dora Epstein-Jones, and the entire Emerging Scholar and Design Hiring Committee for allowing me to join you all for the next couple of years. So for those of you who don't know me, as Elizabeth mentioned, I am a licensed architect, a computational designer, and I've worked at a variety of architectural scales through my small practice, Bako, which is an acronym for the Andy Bako Architecture and Design Company, but it's also just kind of a bad company as well. And it's through this platform that we've had the privilege of working on a broad spectrum of projects ranging from built architectural work to installations and exhibitions to also UX design and digital world building. And so at its core, I think my work and practice operates within this gap between reality and its representation. And I tend to speculate on the ways in which an ecology of tools, working methods, and a continuum between physicality and virtuality impact design thinking and produce opportunities for intervention in the built environment. I completed my MArch-1 degree in 2019 from Harvard GSD, and it was through my thesis project titled Normal House in which these sensibilities began to fully emerge. So this project explored the intersection of suburban architecture, consumer choice, and really the tensions between architectural form and its representation. And the project critiqued how post-war suburban housing and mass media perpetuated an ideal of normality that, despite its exclusionary origins and unsustainable growth, continues to shape today's housing market. And so Normal House challenged the illusion of individuality in suburban development, proposing an alternative that addresses the uncertainties of contemporary domestic living. And it was through the representational lens of the construction document and the consumer app, and it asked how a flexible, unpredictable architecture could accommodate a more adaptable model home. So following my graduation from the GSD in 2019, I returned to Toronto and was striving to gain my license, and kind of took a 180-degree pivot from the GSD design machine, and I entered into the world of large-scale construction. Working on the construction administration team for this project. This is the CIBC Square office tower in Toronto, Canada. And it was during this process that I was responsible for on-site coordination. And although seemingly a complete opposite end of the discipline from my current interests, I would say that my experience in construction in many ways shaped my sensibilities towards design and in the feedback between reality and its representation. So in this role, I would often navigate between construction documents, answer RFIs, and in some cases draw and watch the thing get built in the same day, right? So there was almost this real-time feedback between office and site. And I would say that while the focus of my lecture today will be mainly on my research and more experimental work, I do want to briefly mention a few projects from the various corners of practice that I've been involved with. This is a house in Prince Edward Island in Canada that I designed and was completed last year. And the house is really kind of defined by this primary axis that is intersected by three, I would call them kind of like stumpy roof gables that in plan create this internal knot of this vaulted ceiling space in the internal volume. And what I think was interesting actually is that although on a completely different side of the discipline, was that during the pandemic, this forced virtuality compressed practice and working on the house, and this project and also a competition, all within the same time frame and within the same workday, right? And so this was a project that was completed for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, titled GTA 360, which was an online multiplayer platform for users to experience this kind of landscape filled with digital artwork that was built in extension to the GTA 2021 Triennial Exhibition of Work hosted at the museum that year. So the exhibition opened at the height of the pandemic, and I think as a result, many art institutions were looking for ways in which the museum experience could be complemented by an online counterpart. And our response was to work together with 7 of the 21 participating artists to help them create digital artwork that was then hosted in this kind of digitally deconstructed landscape, allowing the experience of the artwork to become traversable through this digital terrain. And outside of my creative practice, I also work as a computational designer together with Volkan Alkanoglu. And together with Volkan, we realized several projects over the past few years together. This one being a labor of love for me personally, which was a permanent sculpture on the campus of the University of Washington at Bothell, which was completed last year. And there's just a few more that I'll mention here. This is a new sculpture titled Cocoon, which recently was completed and installed in Taipei, Taiwan, this past spring. And while those are made out of kind of laser cut and break-formed aluminum and stainless steel, there are 2 others that were recently completed, although a completely different system. These are 3D printed by a company based in Tennessee called Branch Technology, that have this unique cellular spatial system to 3D print at a large scale. So this was a project in Thornton, Colorado, and another one that was installed last year in Waterton, Massachusetts. So with all of that in mind, and kind of the breadth of work that I've sort of been a part of over the past few years, I turn to the title of today's lecture, which is The Meat We Live In. So the title is also the title of my Design 5 speculative studio this semester, and I just want to sort of unpack where this comes from. So the meat here in The Meat We Live In comes from the term meat space, which was coined in the early 1990s as internet slang to kind of describe the physical world in contrast and separate from cyberspace, right? And I think that kind of offers a provocative starting point for our discussion today. It draws attention to the relationship between physicality and virtuality, foregrounding how we experience and engage with these overlapping realms. But meat also refers to something more in the context in the studio. It prompts a reconceptualization of materiality and material practice in architecture, particularly as we confront issues of sustainability and adaptive reuse. And so in The Meat We Live In the studio, we're challenging the conventional boundaries between the physical and the digital, exploring how materials, both tangible and virtual, can be recycled, repurposed, and reimagined. And so our approach treats material not as this kind of static entity, but as something that exists in this kind of feedback loop between the real and the virtual, or between form and its representation. I also want to draw from a concept from the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who has this idea of, or describes the world as flesh, right? And that I think offers a deeper philosophical lens for understanding this tension. And so for Merleau-Ponty, flesh is not merely a physical substance, but this fundamental element that connects the perceiver and the perceived, right? It's a medium through which we experience the world. It's a lived, relational materiality that blurs the lines between body and the environment, and between subject and object. And so he also sort of explains this through another term called the chasm, right? Which he describes as this mutual intertwining of the self and the world, right? And I think that reinforces this view when the physical and the perceptual are always intertwined, constantly shaping and reshaping each other. And so in architecture, this concept of flesh blurs the boundaries between the physical and digital realms. And I would say that our engagement with space is no longer simply a matter of physical presence. It's mediated by technologies that extend and complicate our perception. And so the meat we live in is thus not purely physical or virtual. It is this layered, shifting environment, continuously negotiated through both our bodies and the virtual interfaces that frame our experience. So for those of you who don't recognize this image, this is a still from Coralie Farjat's The Substance, which is the spectacular new body horror film that for me has kind of forever ruined shrimp and rotisserie chicken. So I don't know if any of you have seen it, but you'll know what I'm talking about. But in the film, the characters or character, Elizabeth and Sue, are one, right? But despite sharing their body or bodies, their experience of reality and also their subjectivity are fundamentally altered by the medium through which they perceive the world, right? This blending of perception and embodiment echoes the central tension in the film. This question of how mediation, whether physical or psychological, can reshape identity, experience, and in their case, self-image. And this brings me to an essay I recently came across by the French transgressive author Georges Bataille. He has this collection of writings called Vision of Excess, right? And within that sort of breadth of work, there's an essay that's titled I. So in I, Georges Bataille reimagines vision not as a clear or controlled process, but as an unstable, seductive, and often horrifying experience. And so the I, which is typically a symbol of clarity and perception, becomes a fragile boundary. It's an interface constantly negotiating the limits between clarity and confusion, and between knowledge and fear. And so much like in the film, Bataille's vision of the I destabilizes traditional ways of seeing. This image with its multiple irises and pupils evokes Bataille's notion that perception is fractured and layered, mediated by the various lenses through which we experience the world. So each I within an I serves as a metaphor for how our subjectivity is shaped by these overlapping realities, how our perception is never singular, but always layered with uncertainty and ambiguity. In this way, the I is no longer just a tool of sight, but a dynamic interface between reality and the subjective experience of the perceiver. And so through my work, I aim to kind of leverage this multiplicity, exploring the evolving relationships between the physical and the virtual, between subject and object, and through the layers of mediation that influence how we perceive the world around us. So this photo, this was taken from my exhibition, Train Yourself, at Kent State University last spring, which depicts a wooden model gazing at its digital counterpart. It's a rendering of itself displayed on the screen, and then also in the animation on the screen, they kind of are levitating and float away. But in this case, the model transforms into both subject and object, continuously referencing and reshaping itself. So prior to joining the faculty at Kent State University last year as the 2023-2024 Shidlowski Fellow, my interest in digital media and its impact on architecture has been longstanding. But my interest in artificial intelligence really only kind of emerged in the past several years. And so this is actually an animation from a course that I was teaching at the University of Toronto in summer of 2020, so during the pandemic. And this group of students, unprompted to do so, produced this animation where they had trained a StyleGAN model on hundreds of images of color-coded suburban floor plans, speculating on the ways in which AI could reinforce this idea of a kind of programmatic bleeding within the home and within the strictures of an otherwise very kind of confining domestic model, right? And based off of the work of those students and kind of what was happening at the time, I became fascinated with generative AI and was also just, became obsessed with the fundamental question of how to produce space and atmospheres and really kind of interrogate the three-dimensionalization of outputs from AI, which at the time was primarily strictly an image-based discourse, right? And so while I think for many Midjourney has kind of replaced the Pinterest board of precedents or representational affinities in design practice or studio, I wanted to think about how the inherent data structure of an image could produce environments in of themselves. And so I'm also sort of partial and inclined towards ideas put forth by my own former professors. I'm deeply influenced by the work of John May and Zaina Koratem of Millions Architecture, who expand upon the notion of image tectonics, or the ways in which information embedded in each pixel can be instrumentalized for its spatial potential. And so this was a series of works in which we were producing images that resemble a family of abstract paintings, basically, exploring how the visual layering of color and brushstrokes begins to produce atmospheric depth. And then through the use of computational tools, we were able to translate the 3-point color coordinates of each pixel within that animation to then inform scale, position, rotation, in this case kind of, and also color, of course, composing a symphony of these kind of voxelized elements in 3D space. And so I think, while I was excited by these initial results, it also begged the question for me of how this fits in within a larger conversation in architectural discourse and digital design. How does AI-generated form fit within the historical lineage of digital practice, tracing its path alongside ideas of motion form, parametricism, digital intricacy, or perhaps alternatively a more projective approach via the post-digital? And for me, this has also dovetailed in my ongoing obsession with the notion of design labor, how we as architects actually perform work. And through the advancements in technology, how do the tools that we use ultimately impact design thinking and our aesthetic sensibilities? And I think also, too, how does time play a central role in shaping our biases and inclinations towards aesthetic preferences? So in tackling this problem, in my first semester at Kent State in the fall, I led a graduate level studio titled No Work Life, in which students addressed the relationship between AI and contemporary design labor through the use or through the design of a speculative office building in downtown Cleveland. And so the course was a research studio that focused on the shifting landscape within the discipline in terms of how we as architects, perform work. And how this has been and will be dramatically impacted by the rise of artificial intelligence. And additionally, the studio expanded upon a discourse around the nature of the contemporary workplace and in general kind of like the office building as a typology. I think that we were speculating on the idea that while some industries demand full-time presence in the office, many companies have adopted more flexible arrangements resulting from the post-pandemic aftershock. And so the workplace, as a result, is much more diffuse than it was previously. And I think, currently our accepted norms pertaining to density, flexibility, and the identity of the workplace are now being radically called into question. So the way in which students engaged with the project was by starting with the establishment of their own library of images that they could use to train an AI model and output a series of animations that interpolate between those images. So as a methodology in the studio, students were working with a medical imaging software that is essentially the same technology used to create 3D models of human organs based off of like a stack of MRI scans, right? So in this case, the animation that they were producing served as that stack of frames that then could get translated into a 3D model, right? So initially, they were essentially generating a massive library of figure ground diagrams to train a style GAN model to then output to get animations like this, right? And then from these animations, they could essentially produce that stack via the medical imaging software. This is the work of one of my students, Reese Jones. His project dealt with the negotiation between blobs and grids, and also kind of dovetailed with Greg Lynn's ideas of motion form and architectural bodies. Coming out from that, these were more or less the direct outputs from those animations as a series of initial study models. And then those led to the development of his final model. Again, it's a speculative project, but it was, again, this kind of strange negotiation between blob and office stack, using the animations and image library also to inform sectional qualities, how he was operating on the ground plane, and then also the sort of different facade conditions in the project. This is the work of Gabriel Firestone. In his and these are model photos, by the way. In his analysis of office typologies, Gabriel was fascinated with the work of Louis Sullivan and the relationship between logics of ornamentation and their translation into office plan typologies. And how also this idea of time plays a role in our perception of objects in space. So thinking about this materially, Gabriel started with the design of a series of small physical artifacts, using his background actually in scenic and set design to create these very otherworldly objects that start to take on the patina of weathered brick, stone, terracotta, or even for the one on the right, I've heard it kind of looks like petrified wood, which ultimately informed the final building design, which he aptly titled Fractured Patina, celebrating this idea of patina and how it influenced both the form of the building, how it negotiates with the site, and then also the kind of layers of ornamentation in this incredibly sort of complex and stratified facade system. That was just another image of his model. So I think, while the studio kind of served as a proof of concept, potentially, of just like the workflow and methodology, one of the fundamental questions of what the studio left me with was this idea of the precedent, or the training set as being paramount in advancing a design agenda and a body of work. And so with the exhibition and body of work that was on display at Kent State in the spring, the project speculated on this idea of referentiality in architecture, investigating the intricate relationship between physical and digital realities, and using AI to create this recursive feedback loop between object and image. And in doing so, the exhibition aimed to produce this kind of immersive spatial atmosphere that operated as a liminal threshold between physicality and virtuality, or as an interface operating within that continuum. And so on that note, the project also celebrated this kind of flattened ontology of mediums and a fluid interplay of techniques across various corners of the design discipline to yield novel aesthetic outcomes, and mixed realities in the post-digital age and in the age of artificial intelligence. So the way in which I kind of approached the exhibition, I owe to many references, but to name a few here, this is the work of artist R.D. Vierkant, who has been developing a body of work titled Image Objects over the past decade. And so in R.D.'s work, the images of the objects in the gallery make their way back onto the surfaces of the objects themselves. And in this way, the work is referential both of its context and of itself. And through my initial research, I became interested in exploring the use of AI as a tool for self-sampling and as a means of exploring architectural autonomy through the relationship between object and image and between the physical and the virtual. And as some of you may know, and of course what you can see from my presentation thus far, is that I'm kind of obsessed with animation, and maybe in another life I would have wanted to pursue a career in film. But it's because of this bias I was naturally influenced by a cinematic reference as a point of departure. These are a few clips from Federico Fellini's 1963 masterpiece titled 8½, which is a wonderfully absurd film about a director's inability to direct a film, okay? And so it's a beautiful movie that weaves together and blurs the distinction between fact, fiction, and dream worlds in this surreal experience that unravels further and further throughout the film. But through 8½, this idea of autoreferentiality starts to emerge. It's a film about a film and within a film. And in my case, I kind of approached the exhibition as an exhibition about the process of producing the exhibition that it's in, more or less. And so within this project narrative and sort of as a point of departure, I felt like I needed my cast of characters, or to co-opt John Hayduke's terminology, I needed my victims. This is Hayduke's sketch for his entry for the 1984 Prince Albert Palais competition in Berlin for the construction of a memorial park. And so victims in the proposal, Hayduke is proposing an intervention which is meant to be developed over time, right? Specifically over two 30-year periods. What he described as being this growing incremental place that has incremental time, right? But another quality that I enjoy here about Hayduke's sketch, aside from the series of architectural follies that begin to resemble characters or take on creaturely qualities, is also the fuzziness of the sketch, right? And this is where I think an idea towards ambiguity and degrees of resolution started to emerge in my own work as well. And also central to Hayduke's research and design are the idea of masques, M-A-S-Q-U-E, which are architectural structures embodying a character specified by the construction of relationship with other elements. And so this idea was influenced by, or the term comes from a masquerade, right? And the accompanying stage set, which was often designed by architects for British nobility in the 17th and 18th century. So in Hayduke, there is a lineage by which architecture is conceived of as both character and site, as kind of existing simultaneously as actor and stage set, right? And being part of a system that has the ability to expand and grow over time. So within my project, in the search for figuration, characters, and the site for the project, my team and I started working with scrap wood and nails as being primary units of measure in the production of architecture, that being structure or framing and fasteners, right? And we were working very quickly and intuitively in the production as what we dubbed and kind of titled as drunk carpenter models. And these are them, right? They're intentionally poorly constructed, have an incredibly low tolerance and fidelity, and at the time served no purpose other than their figural qualities, right? And served as the inputs to then train the AI data set, okay? So after photographing these models, we began to propagate the image data set through a process that I call image breeding, where in Midjourney, and you can do this a variety of different ways, but the way we were doing it is in Midjourney, you take 2 or more images and blend them with themselves to create new self-similar images. Similar, but not the same. And I think that this process is kind of effective in the production of a taxonomy in which visual patterns start to emerge, such as the density of wood, the presence of appendages versus mass, the number of nails, and sort of the kind of features that you can distinguish between them. And it was through this training set that we were able to kind of enter into the next phase of the project, which borrowed essentially the series of techniques that we were exploring in the graduate studio. So after generating the series of animations based off of that image library, we could then feed those into the medical slicing software to generate our 3D meshes. And one thing that I'll mention is that the output from the slicing software is essentially, it's an extrusion from a stack of images, right? But I kind of think of it like pasta, right? It's like you're extruding pasta, but the metal die is constantly changing, right? And changing shape over time. And so while I kind of appreciated and liked these columns as forms, we again wanted to challenge the impulse to use these directly and instead think about the ways in which a conversation can start to emerge between automated output and also degrees of design intervention and intentionality on the part of us, the designers, the architects. So it was, through the use of digital sculpting software, we essentially created a new series of primitives by taking those columns and booleaning them back on themselves, In this case, kind of creating a new library of objects that we could further kind of manipulate, study in the round, and be utilized for some initial mock-ups for fabrication. So of course, in thinking about the ways in which these forms could be fabricated at gallery scale, we were considering different fabrication methodologies, and in order to preserve the fidelity and detail of the model to within like a certain resolution, but also being able to prototype at a large scale, we landed on the idea of creating a laser cut lattice with cardboard and then actually soaking fabric in wet concrete and draping it over top of the formwork, almost like a kind of concrete paper mache, if you will. And the reason for this is we had discussed the idea of these models negotiating between something that appears to be massive and chunky, but then also depending on your orientation relative to the object, ends up becoming much more sort of surfacial and light and ephemeral. And so we were starting to think about the different aesthetic and experiential qualities for these objects to subvert your expectations of the way in which you assume materials should behave. And so I think like our first experiment at doing this was in many ways a failure, or maybe a happy failure to some degree, partially because in this kind of, I don't know, like a late night fever dream or not being satisfied with the results of the level of resolution we were achieving, we coated the entire object with fabric, and this made the removal of the formwork on the interior almost impossible. And so naturally, we decided to burn it out. Hoping that the fire-resistant properties of the rockite would be enough to hold the form of the shape under intense heat. I was kind of thinking about, Zoom Thor's chapel and kind of burning out the formwork and seeing if that would work in real life. But it didn't work out entirely. Some, but not all of the models survived. But I think through this failure, another opportunity emerged, which was the aesthetic of the charring in certain areas of the concrete, which I didn't necessarily know what to do with yet, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So instead of being so rigid with the notion that the concrete form needed to produce a dutiful depiction of the 3D meshes we had created, we instead celebrated the idea of this reconstitution of the model together with the original scrap wood models. And this is where we thought about the notion of an assembly, right? And the way of working that through kind of multiple iterations and layers, you could develop a project and a methodology that gains resolution and tolerance over time and sequentially, right? And alternatively, also a process that is informed by its own image through each one of those sort of constituent parts. So this was the reconstituted model back with the original wood models. And so this led to the idea of a model that is trained on its own image. And that gains formal resolution through a series of layers, each that have their own methodology, degrees of tolerance, fidelity, and resolution. And so the wood layer served as the structure for this, right? If we're to think about kind of a conceptual architectural wall assembly, right? The wood layers were structural both physically and conceptually as the AI model is trained on their image. A substructure emerges out of this, albeit kind of like a 60% baked version of the models we get out of the computer. So they do have, features that, kind of are the silhouette or, the outline of what we were sort of achieving virtually. But then the final layer of this was this incredibly precise ornamental crust, which essentially binded the whole project together. And for this, what we did is we rescanned the entire assembly and relied on the image produced through the UV map of the photogrammetric scan as having agency in this process. So I'm sure some or most of you kind of know what texture mapping is or what a UV map is as it applies into architecture. But for those who aren't, I'd like to think of it as essentially wrapping a Christmas gift digitally, right? In this case, our photogrammetric scan is the three-dimensional object, and then the flattened version is the texture map that is applied onto that, right? So as I mentioned beforehand, seeing the burns on the previous model started to get us to think about the different ways in which color and texture actually on the model itself could have a form of agency in this final step. And so what we started to do was when in this second iteration, we were pouring the concrete with different pigments actually to get a much more kind of intense surface condition or kind of like a visual gradient that could be explored in terms of its contrast, hue and saturation, et cetera. And then using that when we were working through the digital sculpting software in the production of this kind of final layer. And so in order to map out the areas of the model that we wanted to have ornamentation, we masked out areas based off of brightness and contrast that were coming from the UV map. And then finally, the images of the original wood model made a comeback. And together with the texture map from the photogrammetric scan, we utilized a digital sculpting software to apply these images as relief back onto its surface. And here are a few renderings of some of the results from that process. This sort of like golden ornamental skin was 3D printed, and it actually sort of fit perfectly back on the original model because it was based off of the 3D scan. So as I mentioned earlier, the exhibition also explores this theme of self-referentiality across a variety of media. And what I'm going to show now is a short, it's like a 3-minute video we produced for the exhibition, which explores these themes through this surreal, speculative kind of back-of-house view of the project. Ooh. Okay. So I just have a few more things I'd like to touch on. So I think the video was kind of a nice segue between the virtual representation and the actual exhibition photographs. And so, as I mentioned earlier on, the exhibition was conceived of as being this kind of liminal threshold between physical and virtual environments, right? And so, the gallery was extremely dark and blocked off with these translucent mylar blankets, which obscured your view of the gallery through its glass window wall. And so the exhibition featured three main sculptural pieces, each composed of the original scrap wood models, a cast fabric substrate, and then the 3D printed ornamental layer. And due to the lighting conditions in the gallery, these layers began to blend, creating this gradient of effects within each object where the material boundaries between them started to dissolve, right? And the layers in these assemblies began to sort of oscillate between their physical presence and also virtual suggestion. These sculptural pieces were exhibited on plinths that were also made from the same fabric that were used to make the sculptures, hovering just above the ground plane with this kind of orange glow emanating from below them. It was also kind of an immersive multimedia exhibition. There were animations playing on monitors, projections onto the gold foil surfaces that also cast reflections of the AI-generated latent spacewalk animations, filling the gallery with a sense of continuous movement. And there was this interplay between the static and the dynamic and between the material and the virtual. Here's a close-up of the second piece, which was more kind of, horizontal and lent itself to kind of being interpreted as this new kind of topography, one that seems to kind of just hover above its own plinth, creating this kind of floating landscape condition. And this was the third and final piece, which was more kind of, immersive in its scale. It was almost 5.5 feet tall and also elevated on essentially a 5-foot plinth. And so it was much more, I would say, absorptive in its scale. Its form and also its sort of size offered a more kind of embodied and absorptive experience. Yet, like the others, it also invited a close reading of its layers through and a broader interpretation of its composite presence. And so I think each piece embodied this kind of multiplicity of readings. You can experience them as whole objects, but the true complexity emerges when you kind of zoom in, right? Where layers of materiality, light, and digital mediation began to unravel into new meanings. And so back again to this idea of like the stratification of perception, this speaks directly to our post-digital condition, where what we see and what we know are constantly in flux, mediated through multiple lenses and realities. So if we think like if perception itself is stratified, fractured by the physical, the virtual, and the symbolic, how do we as architects and designers negotiate this shifting terrain? How can we embrace these multiplicities to create spaces that are both provoke and adapt, that reflect the complexities of contemporary perception? And I think that this is a fundamental question that I hope to engage with over the course of my fellowship here at UTSOA. And I want to end my talk today with just briefly mentioning some works in progress that I've been focusing on over the past couple of months during my time here. Firstly, bless you. Firstly, I want to thank Professors Daniel Kohler, Clay Odom, and Corey Beeg for inviting me to participate in their exhibition, Architecture After AI, where I was able to show a few images, or allow images from my exhibition at Kent to recombine and emerge as a new series of works titled Rough Cuts, which represent a series of fragmented aesthetic ecologies, which I hope to mine from and inform future work. But as we reflect on the evolving role of architecture today, Bataille's reimagining of the eye serves as a powerful metaphor. So just as he presents the eye as hovering between clarity and confusion, flickering between the real and the imagined, architecture operates within a similar tension. This ambiguity that emerges from the interplay of digital and physical spaces can emerge as an opportunity to invite interaction across multiple levels of perception. Bataille's removal of the eye, a metaphor for destabilizing traditional modes of seeing, prompts us to consider how our experienced reality is similarly fragmented and layered. And in a post-digital context, this fragmentation is mediated through multiple eyes, right? The screens of augmented reality headsets, smartphones, and other digital filters that reframe our interaction with the world around us. And these devices act as additional lenses, each mediating our experience of reality in distinct ways. And I think that architecture has to adapt to this stratification. Over the past several weeks, I've been exploring the ways in which we can expand our understanding of materiality in architecture through the interplay of generative AI and mixed reality tools. And just to kind of plug my seminar for the spring, in the spring term, I'll be leading a seminar course titled Recycling Reality, focusing on the role of architectural details as dynamic elements that have the ability to operate within a mixed reality interface. And so this kind of coincides with my current research focus. The course will emphasize both physical and digital resourcefulness, encouraging students to create architectural details that can function within augmented environments and while addressing pressing societal issues, including scarcity and waste, allowing students to address the issue of architectural recycling as a framework to reconstitute both physical and virtual matter. So I think architecture today becomes a site of ambiguity where function, perception, and materiality converge. And I think a task for architects today is to embrace these uncertainties, recognizing their potential to provoke, unsettle, and engage, ultimately creating richer, more interactive experiences that reflect the fluid, layered realities of contemporary living. And it's through this kind of embrace of multiplicity that architecture can continue to evolve, creating spaces that challenge, seduce, terrify potentially, and expand our understanding of what it means to engage with the built environment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.